The cold came in sideways, carried on a wind that sounded like gravel poured down a stovepipe. Mara Kline tasted it before she felt it, metallic, dry, and sharp enough to make her tongue ache. The lantern light at the edge of the claim flickered blue at the wick, a bad sign in a world where small signs often arrived before large deaths. In the hollow of the hill, the old root cellar waited like a swallowed stone, its low door framed by frost-whitened weeds and a sagging lintel of hand-hewn timber. The settlement behind them, Cedar Run, still had lamplight in a few windows and the soft bark of a dog. People would be laughing in those rooms, laughing at the idea of living underground like moles, laughing at Owen's engineer mind, laughing at Mara for following him out here instead of insisting on a proper cabin with a respectable chimney. Out here, the night had no respect for reputations. Owen set down the pry bar and breathed into his gloves. The air crystallized and fell in a faint sparkle. "It's turning," he said, eyes narrowed at the sky. No snow yet, just a hard, clean vault of stars that meant the warmth had drained away without clouds to hold it. A strip of paper nailed to the post near their wagon fluttered stiffly. On it, Owen had written a number in charcoal, big enough to read by lantern. 35, 35. He hadn't guessed. He'd measured it. The glass tube of his spirit thermometer hung from a nail, sheltered from the lantern's heat. The red column had sunk to a line so low it looked like it might vanish into the bulb. Mara stared at it until her eyes watered. "We've got 10 minutes, Owen said, and his voice went tight in a way she'd learned to trust. Maybe less if the wind shifts again. 10 minutes for what? Her throat felt scraped raw. Talking hurt. For the door to ice in place, he said. For the hinges to lock up. For the air to start behaving stupid. Mara understood the last part more than she wanted to. Cold did that. Made simple things fail. Rope turned to wire. Nails snapped. Skin stuck to metal like meat to a butcher's hook. And people, proud people, kept trying the same plans until their plans killed them. They had made a different plan. That was why they were here, lantern in hand, standing over a hole in the hill everyone else avoided because it smelled like old potatoes and damp stone. Mara knelt and brushed away a crust of snow from the cellar door. The plank surface was rough, patched with different woods from different decades. Someone long ago had hammered iron strap hinges into it, and time had eaten them into a lace of rust. Owen wedged the pry bar under the edge and leaned his weight. The door groaned like a ship plank. A thin line of darker air seeped out, carrying a smell of earth, cool, not cold, damp, but not rotting. Mara's heart did a small, stupid leap. Outside, death. Inside, maybe not. The door gave with a crack. Owen held it, muscles shaking, while Mara shoved her shoulder against the wood. Together they swung it open just enough to slip through. The cellar breathed on them. Not warm exactly, but steady, like a hand on your back in a storm. Owen lowered the lantern into the opening. The light revealed stone walls stacked without mortar, their seams chinked with clay that had dried and cracked like old paint. A dirt floor sloped gently to the back, where a shallow pit had been dug. Someone's attempt at drainage, long forgotten. 2 barrels stood in the corner, empty. Shelving lined one wall, warped but intact. And overhead, thick earth pressed down on rough joists, the hill's weight making the space feel both safe and suffocating. Mara climbed down first, boots finding the old steps cut into packed soil. The air was cooler than a cabin, but it didn't bite. It didn't strip the moisture from her nose and turn her breath into knives. The difference was so sudden she felt dizzy. Owen followed, dragging a canvas bundle, blankets, a tin of matches, a coil of stovepipe, and the small iron box he'd paid too much for. His heater, as he called it, though it didn't look like any stove Mara had ever seen. He set it down carefully, like a newborn. Above them, the wind rose and fell, testing the open doorway. Mara could feel the draft like an invisible hand trying to pull their heat away before they even made any. Owen looked up at the entrance and then at Mara. "If we don't get this sealed right," he said, "we'll freeze in a better-looking grave." Mara swallowed and forced her hands to stop shaking. "Then we seal it." He nodded once, and the movement told her he was scared too. He just didn't let fear drive. They worked fast, not with panic, but with urgency sharpened into focus. Owen shoved a rolled burlap strip into the gap around the doorframe. Mara packed clay into the burlap with her bare fingers until they burned, the clay gritty and half frozen. Owen hammered wooden wedges into the hinge side so the door would press tight when shut. Why not just build a cabin? Mara heard a voice in her memory, Mrs. Halverson at the general store, lips pursed around judgment. "People need a proper roof. God sees you in a house." God, Mara thought, might see better through a roof of earth. Owen held the lantern close to the seam and lit a match. The flame leaned sharply toward the crack. "Still pulling," he muttered. He shifted the wedge, tightened the latch, and Mara packed more clay until her nails filled with mud and her knuckles went numb. Owen struck another match. This time, the flame trembled but didn't bow. "Better," he said. "Not perfect." Outside the door, a sound carried through the earth, wood snapping in the distance, sharp as a gunshot. A tree, surrendering to cold stress. Mara stared at Owen. "That started already." He nodded and wiped his hands on his coat. "That's why we're here before everyone else figures out they're in trouble." "Do you think they will?" she asked. Owen looked toward the ceiling, as if he could see through the packed soil to the scattered cabins and tents of Cedar Run. "Not until it hurts," he said. "And by then, hurting won't be the worst part." Mara felt the open loop of it, the promise and the threat braided together. They had chosen an old cellar that smelled like history and mold. They had gambled their last dollars on pipe and iron, and Owen's stubborn brain. If the hill held steady temperature, if the air stayed breathable, if the heater didn't choke them with smoke, they might outlast what was coming. If not, the cellar would become the story the town told to scare children into obedience. Owen set the iron box on a flat stone and began fitting the first length of stovepipe. "We test the system tonight," he said. "Just a small burn. We watch the draft. We watch the walls for sweat." Mara crouched beside him, lantern throwing their shadows across the stone like two figures in a cave painting. "And if it fails?" Owen paused, eyes meeting hers. "Then we fix it before the real cold arrives." Above them, the wind hit the hillside hard enough to make dirt sift down from the joists in a faint, dusty rain. Mara flinched. Owen didn't. He tightened the pipe collar, then checked the seam with his fingertips, the way a carpenter checks a joint. "Earth is a better blanket than boards," he said quietly, "but only if we keep it dry and give the smoke a path to leave." Mara listened to the distant howl and the nearer silence of the cellar, steady as a held breath. She realized something then, something that made her ribs ache with a mixture of fear and hope. They weren't hiding, they were proving. And somewhere out there, in cabins with thin walls and proud chimneys, people were about to learn the difference between warmth that looks respectable and warmth that actually stays. By morning, the thermometer outside the hatch still clung below zero, but the cellar's air had barely shifted. Mara woke with her cheek against a folded blanket and the strange feeling of having slept through something she wasn't supposed to survive. The lantern had burned low, leaving a sweet, oily smell. Owen was already up, crouched near the stovepipe like a priest tending an altar. He held his hand near the iron box, not close enough to scorch, just close enough to feel a gentle push of warmth. "We didn't spike," he said, voice hushed, as if the hill might overhear. 45 inside at the warmest point. 39 by the door. Mara blinked. "Fahrenheit?" He nodded. "And that's with the hatch sealed and only a cautious burn. If we can keep condensation off the walls and keep the draft steady, we can ride out worse. Worse. The word sat between them like an extra tool, heavy and necessary. They climbed out after breakfast, hard bread softened in hot water, and the wind slapped their faces raw. Cedar Run lay a half-mile downslope, smoke columns listing sideways. The river beyond had a skin of new ice that flashed like broken glass. Mara and Owen walked into town with their shoulders hunched, both from cold and from the weight of being watched. Even this early, the general store had a knot of men warming their hands over a barrel brazier. The fire popped, but the heat didn't travel far. When Mara pushed open the store door, a bell clinked above her head. Heads turned. Conversations paused in that way that pretends to be casual. "Morning," Mara said, and kept her voice steady. Silas Brune leaned on the counter, broad as an ox, and always smelling faintly of tobacco and horse. His eyes flicked to Owen's mud-stained gloves. "You two still playing burrower?" he asked. Owen set a small list on the counter. Galvanized nails, a sack of lime, 2 lengths of tin pipe, and a bundle of oiled canvas. "We're building," he said. Silas snorted. "You can't build a home in a vegetable hole. That's not living. That's hiding." Mrs. Halverson appeared from the back room like judgment given legs. Her grey hair was pinned tight, her mouth tighter. "My Henry says you're sleeping under dirt," she said, loud enough for everyone. "Like it's the war. Like you're ashamed to be seen." Mara felt heat rise behind her eyes, not from the stove in the corner. "We're not ashamed," she said. "We're trying to stay alive." That pulled a few chuckles, the kind meant to be friendly, but sharpened at the edges. A younger man, Caleb Voss, rubbed his hands together and said, "Alive from what? A bit of cold? This is frontier winter. You stack wood. You keep a fire. You don't go crawling into a hole and calling it clever." Owen didn't bristle. That was the thing about him. He saved his anger for problems that could be solved with it. He reached into his coat and set the spirit thermometer on the counter, careful as if it were glass medicine. "It was 22 before dawn," he said, "and it's dropping fast with this clear sky." Silas waved a hand. "We've had 20 before. We're still here." Owen's finger tapped the counter once. "A cabin loses heat by surface area and wind exposure. You can throw more wood at it, yes, but if the wind steals faster than you feed, you're only buying time." Mrs. Halverson's nostrils flared. "Are you saying our houses are foolish?" "I'm saying they're predictable," Owen replied. "Earth isn't. Earth holds." Caleb laughed. "Listen to him, talking like a book. Next he'll be measuring the Lord's breath with that little tube." A few more men laughed, and Mara felt the familiar sting of being the odd pair in a place that valued sameness as safety. She gripped the counter edge until her fingertips hurt. Owen didn't argue further. He only slid coins across and collected their supplies. On the way out, Silas called after them, "When you come crawling back for a proper bed, don't expect the town to dig you out." Outside, the wind hit again, and Mara's eyes watered, so no one could tell if she was angry or simply freezing. They walked back uphill with the canvas and pipe strapped to a sled. The sky had turned the hard color of iron. Every breath felt like it scraped the inside of Mara's chest. Halfway up, Owen stopped and looked at the hillside, where the cellar door sat nearly flush with the ground. "They think we're hiding from life," he said. Mara pulled her scarf tighter. "They think anything different is an insult." Owen nodded slowly. "We don't need them to approve. We need the system to work." They reached the hatch and slipped inside, sealing the world out behind them. The difference in sensation was immediate again, like stepping from a knife edge into a sheltered room. Not warm, but not actively trying to kill you. Owen unrolled a rough sketch on a crate top. Mara leaned in. The drawing showed the cellar in cross-section. 2 vertical pipes, one marked in and the other out, with a little angled hood on top of each. "Stack effect," Owen said, tracing the lines with a charcoal-stained finger. "Warm air rises. If we give it a higher exit, it will pull fresh air in low, even with the hatch sealed. But the trick is not letting the cold air fall straight onto us." Mara pictured a river of cold pouring down from above. "So we turn it?" "We baffle it." Owen picked up a scrapboard and held it near the wall. "We make the intake dump behind a screen, canvas or burlap, so the air mixes before it reaches our bodies. Slow the current, keep oxygen without wind." Mara looked around at the stone walls. In the lantern light, they shimmered slightly, dark where yesterday's clay had been pressed. "And the damp? That's why the lime." Owen's eyes sharpened, mind already moving. "We whitewash the walls. Lime is alkaline. It discourages mold. It also seals some pores. And we keep a dry heat source, not a roaring fire, a steady one." Mara exhaled and watched her breath, faint and thin instead of a thick cloud. "If it works," she said, "they'll still laugh until something happens." Owen folded the sketch. "Something is going to happen," he said softly. "You don't get this kind of sky, this kind of wind, and not pay for it later." The hill creaked above them as frost worked its way deeper into the ground. Mara imagined Cedar Run's cabins, timbers shrinking, chinking, loosening, smoke pulled backward down chimneys when gusts hit wrong. Outside, people were building bigger fires. Inside, Mara and Owen were building a home that didn't need to fight the wind at all. The first real problem wasn't cold, it was water. 2 afternoons after the store laughter, the sky softened into a dull grey, and the wind eased, almost gentle. The temperature climbed just enough that the crusted snow on the hill began to sweat. Meltwater ran in thin, shiny threads across the ground, quiet as thieves, seeking the lowest place, which was, of course, their door. Mara noticed it when she stepped outside to shake a blanket. The air smelled different, heavier. Her boots sank a thumb's depth into the surface. Near the hatch, a wet crescent had formed where the soil met the wooden frame. "Owen," she called, and tried to keep her voice calm. He came out with a length of pipe under his arm, and froze when he saw the darkening ring. He dropped to one knee and pressed a finger to the mud. "If that seeps under," he said, "it'll turn the floor into a sponge. Then the walls sweat, then the bedding stays damp, then we lose heat just trying to dry ourselves." Mara pictured it. Damp wool, chilled bones, the cellar turning from shelter to slow trap. "What do we do?" Owen stood and scanned the slope like a man reading an enemy's approach. "We make the water go somewhere else." They spent the next hour shoveling a shallow trench in a wide arc uphill from the hatch. The soil was half frozen, stubborn. Each strike of the spade rang through the hill. Mara's shoulders burned. Owen's breath came in harsh bursts that steamed and vanished. "This is why cabins sit on piers," Mara muttered between swings. "And this is why cellars need drainage," Owen replied. Not defensive, just factual, as if water had rules and they were finally obeying them. He had them cut the trench with a slight fall toward a natural dip in the terrain, then line it with fist-sized stones scavenged from the creek bed. Over that, they poured a layer of gravel from sacks they'd hauled by sled. The sound of gravel was comforting, dry, controlled, like an answer. "A French drain," Owen said, wiping grit from his palms. "Water enters the trench, drops through the stone, then runs along the gravel instead of across the surface. It'll bypass the hatch." Mara watched the meltwater as if it were alive. Already it was choosing the new path, slipping into the rocky channel and disappearing with a small, satisfied hiss. "Inside," Owen said. "We need a sump." They climbed down into the cellar and moved crates aside. The floor sloped to the back where the old shallow pit lay. Owen dug it deeper with a narrow spade, carving out a basin about the width of a washtub. Mara carried out buckets of damp soil, her fingers numb even through gloves. When the pit was deep enough, Owen layered the bottom with gravel and set a short clay tile in the lowest point, like a throat. "If water ever gets in," he said, "it collects here, not under our bedding, not against the walls." "And then?" Mara asked. Owen held up a small hand pump he'd traded for last summer, an awkward iron thing that smelled of machine oil. "Then we pull it out, or we bail it, but we know where it will be." That was his gift, not stopping every problem, but forcing problems to arrive in predictable places. By evening, the temperature dropped again. The grey sky cleared, and with clearing came the snap, the sudden return of hard cold. The meltwater in the trench crusted over, locking the stones in place like a fitted lid. Mara crouched by the hatch seam and listened. The hillside was quiet, except for distant timber creaks. She pressed her palm against the stone wall inside. It felt cool, but not hostile. The earth held yesterday's mildness like a secret. Owen tested the sump pit with a lantern. A thin pool had collected at the bottom, no bigger than a dinner plate. "Better here than everywhere," he said. That night, they ate beans warmed in a tin pot over the iron heat box. Owen kept the burn small, feeding it thumb-thick sticks and a few coal chunks. The heat didn't rush. It seeped. Mara felt it in her back when she leaned against the stone, warmth stored in mass, paid in patience. Still, she could smell damp in the corners. Not rot, but the raw smell of earth that had been woken. "We should lime-wash tomorrow," she said. Owen nodded. "After we finish the berm." "The berm?" He pointed to the hatch from inside, where the door frame met bare air. "That wood is exposed. Wind will steal heat through it. We mound soil up around the entrance, like a collar. Reduce the exposed surface, reduce the loss." Mara smiled without meaning to. "You talk like the wind is a pickpocket." "It is," Owen said, serious. "And it's very good at its job." Above them, the cold returned with a vengeance, and the hills stiffened. Mara lay under blankets and listened to the faint tick of contracting wood, the gentle draw of air through their not-yet-finished vents. In town, fires would be burning hotter to make up for what the wind stole. Here, they had redirected water, shaped earth, and started to turn a forgotten cellar into something engineered, something that didn't need bravado to survive. The laughter from Cedar Run felt farther away than the half-mile of frozen ground. It felt like it belonged to a different season. The next danger arrived without drama. A wet sheen on stone, a headache behind Mara's eyes, the flame of the lantern pulling thin as if starving. She noticed it at dawn. The cellar felt the same temperature, but the air felt thicker, as if someone had laid a damp quilt over her mouth. When she sat up, she saw it. Tiny beads of moisture along the north wall, catching the lantern light like fish scales. "Owen," she whispered. He was already awake, watching the lantern flame. It stood straight for a moment, then leaned toward the ceiling and fluttered. Owen's jaw tightened. "Stale pocket," he said. "We sealed too well." Mara's stomach dropped. "So all that clay, it's hurting us?" "Sealing keeps heat," Owen said, calm but fast. "But humans are little furnaces that burn oxygen. If we don't control the exchange controls us." He pulled out his sketch again, the cross-section smudged from use. 2 pipes, one low, one high, a baffle on the intake, a hood against wind. "We do it today," he said, "before you start feeling sick." They hauled the tin pipe up to the surface. The wind had shifted from northwest to west, scraping the hillside clean and piling snow in drifts like frozen waves. Owen chose a spot 3 paces uphill from the hatch and drove a pointed iron rod into the ground, testing for stone and roots. The hill was mostly packed soil with scattered rocks. Good. He marked 2 circles, one for the exhaust pipe, which needed height, the other for the intake, which needed to draw from low and sheltered air. We cut through the roof, Mara asked, looking at the earth above their heads and imagining collapse. Not through the center, Owen said. Near the edge where the joists are closest to the wall. Less span, less risk, and we sleeve it so the dirt doesn't crumble into the pipe. They dug carefully, each shovel bite measured. When they reached the top layer of rough boards that formed the cellar's roof, Owen switched to a handsaw. The saw teeth rasped in the cold, loud enough that Mara wondered if the town could hear it. Once the hole was cut, Owen slid a short section of wider pipe, his sleeve, through the opening, packed the gap with clay and lime putty, and then fed the narrower stovepipe through the sleeve. It was like giving the hill a throat lined with metal so it wouldn't choke on its own soil. Now we need height, he said. They joined 2 lengths of pipe and braced them with wire to a stake. On the top, Owen fashioned a hood from flattened tin, angled so wind would pass over and tug air upward instead of forcing snow down. Mara watched him work, hands precise despite the cold. How do you know the wind will pull it? Owen set the hood and pointed. Wind moving over an opening lowers pressure, like when you blow across a bottle and it hums. It's not magic. It's a shortcut for the draft. They repeated the process for the intake, but this pipe ended near the floor inside the cellar. Owen made the outside end shorter and tucked it behind an earth berm so it wouldn't suck in blowing snow. Inside, he built the baffle, a wooden box with slats and a layer of burlap, positioned so incoming air had to change direction twice before reaching the living space. Cold air is heavy, he explained, as he nailed the last slat. If it drops straight onto you, you'll feel a draft even if the room is stable. If we slow it and mix it, we get oxygen without the knife. When they finished, Mara held the lantern near the intake baffle. The flame leaned slightly toward it, steady and sure. Owen exhaled, a sound close to relief. It's moving. They tested the exhaust with a scrap of smouldering punkwood. Smoke curled upward, hesitated, then slid into the pipe as if it had found a familiar road. It vanished with a soft whoosh. Mara rubbed her temples. The headache that had been blooming all morning began to ease. So we're not poisoning ourselves. Not today, Owen said. But we'll keep testing. Draft changes with weather. If snow buries the intake, we'll feel it. They spent the afternoon lime-washing the walls, the white paste turning stone brighter, almost clean. The cellar looked less like a grave and more like a room someone meant to return to. The lime smell was sharp but reassuring, like soap in a place that had never known it. As evening fell, Mara sat near the iron heat box and listened to the new sound of their home, a faint, constant breath through the pipes. Not wind, not silence, something in between. Outside, the sky cleared again, and the cold deepened like a tightening fist. Mara realized the odd comfort of it. The colder the world became, the more their choices mattered. In a cabin, you could blame the weather. In a cellar, you had to own your design. Owen checked the thermometer inside and nodded once. Stable, he said. That's what we need when the numbers get ugly. Mara looked at the hatch, the berm, the white walls, the 2 pipes rising into the dusk like antlers. Let them laugh, she said quietly. We're building a breathing hill. Owen's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. And hills don't care about opinions. The heater was the part Mara trusted least, because fire always demanded worship. Owen called it a dry heat box, but to her it looked like a squat iron chest with a small door and a collar for pipe. No legs, no wide belly like a parlour stove, just a tight cube meant to burn slowly. He'd found it in a crate at a trading post 2 towns over, the kind of place where odd tools waited for men desperate enough to believe. Fuel in, he'd said then, eyes bright. Heat stored in stone, smoke out. Minimal flame. Minimal flame sounded like minimal comfort. Now, with the vents breathing and the walls chalk white, Owen set the box on a flat slab he'd levelled near the centre of the cellar. He laid smaller stones around it like a low hearth, then arranged 2 courses of bricks scavenged from an abandoned chimney. The bricks weren't for beauty, they were for distance. Mara understood that much. Heat too close to wood meant fire where you couldn't see it. "You're building a little house for the fire," she said. "A channel for it," Owen corrected, fitting the first section of stovepipe and sealing the joints with clay. "If the smoke cools too fast, it stalls and falls back. If it stays hot long enough to rise, it leaves clean." He didn't run the pipe straight out. Instead, he laid it along the wall, horizontal for a few feet, then angled it up toward the exhaust sleeve. "Why not the shortest path?" Mara asked. Owen tapped the pipe. "Because the shortest path wastes heat. Smoke is hot. We steal some of that heat before it goes. So the pipe is a radiator." "Exactly." He set thin stone slabs behind the pipe as a shield, then left a finger-width gap so air could pass. "We don't want the wall to cook unevenly and sweat. We want gentle warmth spread across mass." Mara watched him work with the careful focus of someone stitching a wound. He moved slowly here, not like with digging or hauling. Fire asked for patience. When the last joint was sealed, Owen pulled out 3 tools, a candle, a strip of paper, and his notebook with small columns of numbers. "We test draft first," he said. "Then we test for backflow. Then we test for carbon stink." Mara frowned. "Carbon stink?" He looked up. "You can't smell the worst kind. That's the problem. But bad draft gives warnings. Smoke, soot, headaches. We watch for them." He lit the candle and held it near the heater door, then near the pipe seam. The flame leaned slightly toward the firebox opening, even though there was no fire yet. Owen nodded. "The exhaust is pulling." He crumpled the strip of paper, lit it, and dropped it into the box. The flame flared bright, then steadied. Smoke rose into the pipe without hesitation. Owen watched it like a hawk watches a field mouse. Minutes passed. The iron warmed enough that Mara could feel it on her shins. Not a blast, not a roar, just a slow seep that made her fingers loosen. Owen fed in a handful of dry twig bundles, then closed the door and adjusted a small sliding vent. "Less air equals slower burn," he said, "but too little and it smoulders. Smoulder makes poison." "So what's the balance?" Mara asked. Owen pointed to the notebook. "We find it, we mark it, then we repeat it." That was the engineering part Mara admired, turning fear into a procedure. After an hour, the stones around the heater felt warm to the touch. The wall behind the pipe held a faint heat too, as if the cellar itself had begun to wake. Mara leaned back against the opposite wall and realized her shoulders weren't hunched. But Owen wasn't satisfied. He stood, ran his hand along the pipe, and then crouched to check the seams again. "No smoke smell," he murmured. Mara watched his face in lantern light. "You're waiting for the trick." "The trick is always there," he said. "In cold weather, draft is strong. In mild weather, it can reverse. In wind, it can surge and pull embers. So we need a way to keep it steady." He stepped outside briefly and returned with a small tin disc, an improvised damper. He installed it in the pipe near the heater, a rotating plate that could restrict flow. If the wind starts pulling too hard, the fire burns too fast. We choke it a little. Not closed, never closed, just controlled. Mara felt the weight of the rule. Never closed. She nodded. They let the heater run another hour, then Owen banked it, packed the coals tight, added a layer of ash, and closed the air vent to a narrow slit. The iron box gave off warmth like a sleeping animal. Mara lay down, and for the first time since arriving, she noticed something else. Her blankets were dry. The air didn't taste damp. Her breath didn't feel trapped. Owen, still awake, whispered, "Feel the wall." Mara pressed her palm to the stone. It was cool, but not cold. It held a quiet warmth that didn't vanish when she lifted her hand. "That's the point," Owen said. We're not trying to heat air. Air runs away. We're heating mass. Outside, the wind returned with a long, hungry howl. Somewhere in town, a dog barked and then went silent. Mara stared into the dim, listening to their pipes breathe, and the heater tick softly as it cooled. For the first time, the cellar didn't feel like a compromise. It felt like a plan. And plans, she knew, were only truly judged when the world did its worst. The first frost trial came on an ordinary night, which was how winter liked to teach lessons, quietly, before it shouted. Mara woke to a sound like fingernails on glass. For a moment she thought it was the wind worrying the vent pipes. Then she realized it was closer, right at the hatch. Ice, forming. She sat up, heart hammering, and the lantern's dim glow revealed a thin white fringe creeping along the bottom of the doorframe. Their clay seal had held against drafts, but moisture from their own breathing had found the coldest edge and turned to crystals. Owen was already moving. He grabbed the lantern and crouched by the hatch, examining the line of frost like a doctor reading a rash. "If it bridges," he said, "it'll glue the door shut." Mara's mouth went dry. "So we could be trapped." "Temporarily," Owen said, though the word felt like a lie in winter. He pressed a finger to the wood and winced. "We need to warm the frame, not the whole room." He pulled a flat stone toward the heater, set it near the iron box for a few minutes, then carried it, carefully, with gloves, to the hatch and leaned it against the bottom seam. A small, targeted heat source. The ice fringe retreated, melting into a dark, wet line that soaked into the burlap. "Tomorrow," Owen said, "we build an inner door, an airlock." Mara stared at him. "In a cellar?" "In any place where cold meets warm air," he replied. "Two barriers. The outer takes the bite. The inner keeps the room stable." They were still dealing with that when the second problem arrived. Smoke. Faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't a cloud. It was a taste, like burnt paper at the back of the throat. Mara's eyes widened. Owen froze, then moved fast. He opened the heater vent slightly, then adjusted the damper. "Backdraft," he said. "Wind just shifted." Mara listened. Through the pipes came a different tone, a low moan. The exhaust was being pressed, not pulled. Owen snatched the candle and held it near the heater door. The flame leaned out, away from the firebox, air trying to push smoke into the room. "Kill the burn," Mara whispered, fear sharpening her voice. "Not kill," Owen said, and his calm made her cling to him. "Stabilize. If we shut it, it smolders. Smolder is worse." He opened the intake baffle panel and checked the burlap. A thin crust of frost had formed on the slats. The incoming air was too cold and too dense, dropping straight down, starving the fire of a steady feed. "Warm the intake," he said. Mara grabbed a spare blanket and wrapped it around the interior section of the intake pipe, leaving a gap at the bottom. Owen positioned a warmed stone near the pipe base, not touching, just close enough to soften the chill. The candle flame steadied a fraction. "Now the exhaust," Owen muttered, climbing the steps to the hatch. Cold slapped in when he cracked the outer door. Mara felt the room's warmth tugged away. She heard Owen scrape at something outside. Snow, ice, maybe the hood. Then he slammed the hatch and resealed it. The moan in the exhaust pipe changed pitch, turning from pressure to pull. Owen returned, cheeks red, eyelashes rimed with white. "Snow built up on the leeward side," he said. "It was blocking the hood gap. Wind had nowhere to go but down." Mara sank onto a crate, shaking. "And if we hadn't noticed?" Owen didn't answer immediately. He checked the seams again, then held the candle by the heater door. The flame leaned inward, safe for now. "We would have gotten sleepy," he said finally, "and then we wouldn't have woken." Mara's throat tightened. The cellar had felt so solid, so engineered, but winter had found a flaw in the most invisible place. Air movement, moisture, tiny physics that didn't care how brave you were. Owen sat beside her, voice quieter. This is why we test before the deep cold. The system isn't done until it survives a bad night. Mara stared at the hatch. The frost fringe had melted, leaving a damp mark. They think we're hiding, she said, more to herself than to him. But we're learning. Owen nodded. And learning is expensive. Better to pay with sweat than blood. They spent the rest of the night in shifts, one sleeping, one watching the heater and the candle flame, listening to the pipes. At dawn, when the sky was still black-blue, Owen measured the temperature again. Outside, 18. Inside, 41. Not comfortable, but survivable, and more importantly, controllable. Mara rubbed her eyes and felt something like grim gratitude. The trial had exposed two weaknesses, door icing and wind-pressed draft, while the world was still only showing its teeth, not its full jaw. Owen folded a new page in his notebook and wrote in block letters, airlock, hood clearance, intake insulation. Mara watched him and realized the cellar wasn't just a shelter. It was becoming a manual, written in mistakes corrected before they could become deaths. By the time they built the inner door, Cedar Run had stopped laughing out loud. Not because anyone admitted doubt, but because winter had begun to collect payments in small coins, a frost-bitten ear on a trapper, a cracked stovepipe in the schoolhouse, a baby's cough that wouldn't loosen. The settlement moved slower. People spoke with less air to spare. Mara and Owen worked anyway, because their own deadline wasn't pride, it was math. The inner door was simple, a frame of scrap lumber set 2 steps inside the hatch, hung with a thick canvas curtain that overlapped on all sides. The gap between outer hatch and inner curtain became a cold pocket, an airlock where frost could form without touching their living air. Owen demonstrated it like a ritual. Outer door opens, he said, pulling it wide. Cold knifed in and died in the small chamber. He closed it, waited 3 breaths, then lifted the canvas flap and stepped into the cellar proper. We keep the warm air behind the second barrier. Mara tried it. The difference was immediate. Less wind bite, less panic in the body. Then came the point of no return, and it didn't arrive with weather. It arrived with a crack of wood and the shout of men. Late one afternoon, while Mara was stirring a pot of barley near the heater, they heard it, voices outside, close and frantic. Owen froze mid-step. The vent pipes hummed with a gust. Then a fist pounded on the outer hatch. "Owen! Mara!" a man yelled. "For God's sake, open!" Owen took the steps 2 at a time. He unlatched the hatch and braced for a rush of cold. In the airlock, Silas Brune stood with his coat unbuttoned, chest heaving. Behind him, Caleb Voss and 2 others strained at something in the snow. A body. Silas's bravado was gone. His face had the grey pinch of fear. "Wagon axle snapped on the ridge," he said fast. "We got turned around in the blow. Caleb shoved his hands forward, fingers waxy and pale, the joints stiff as carved wood. Mara's stomach lurched. "We can't get him warm," Silas said, swallowing hard. "Our stove smoked out. The chimney's iced. We need a place that holds." He didn't say the word cellar. He didn't say sorry. But his eyes did something new. They asked. Owen's gaze flicked to Mara, a silent question. Their cellar could hold 2 people comfortably. 4, maybe, if careful. More than that meant moisture, oxygen demand, heat load. Mara thought of Mrs. Halverson's tight mouth, of laughter at the store. Then she looked at Caleb's hands and realized Winter didn't care about grudges. "Bring him in," she said. Owen didn't argue. He stepped aside and helped drag Caleb through the outer hatch and into the airlock. The cold followed like a beast sniffing at the threshold, but the inner curtain held it back. Inside, Mara cleared space near the heater, not too close. Direct heat could damage frostbitten tissue. Owen had explained that once. Warm too fast, and you hurt what you're trying to save. "Boots off," Mara ordered, voice sharper than she felt. Slow warming, no rubbing. Silas stared at her as if she'd become someone else. "You know what you're doing?" "I know what panic does," she snapped, then softened. "And Owen knows the rest." Owen moved like a man in his element. He checked Caleb's breathing, then wrapped his hands in dry cloth and placed warmed stones near them. Not on them. He mixed warm water with a pinch of salt and had Caleb sip, little by little. Caleb's teeth chattered so hard, Mara feared they'd break. I thought you were crazy," he managed. "Save your talk," Owen said, not unkindly. "Save your heat." Silas hovered near the inner curtain, looking at the pipes, the whitewashed walls, the neat stack of fuel. "How warm is it in here?" he asked, voice hushed. "Stable," Owen replied. "Not luxury. Stable." Silas's eyes flicked to the thermometer hanging from a nail. 42.42. Outside, the wind was rising again, and the sky had that clear, cruel look Owen had warned about. Stars like ice chips. Silas swallowed. "If it drops like you said it might, can you take more?" That was the question that turned Mara's spine to ice. Not because she didn't want to help, but because helping had limits, and limits could kill everyone if ignored. Owen didn't answer immediately. He walked to the intake baffle and placed his palm near it, feeling the flow. Then he looked at the heater, the fuel stack, the moisture already rising from 4 extra bodies. "We can take a few," he said carefully, "but we need rules. No wet coats inside the main room. Snow stays in the airlock. And if more come, we rotate. Keep air fresh and heat steady." Silas nodded too quickly. "Anything. Just don't let him lose his hands." Mara watched Caleb's fingers as color slowly returned at the edges, painful pink blooming from the dead white. He hissed through clenched teeth, tears freezing on his lashes before they could fall. Outside, Cedar Run's chimneys would be struggling, smoke pressed down by wind and cold. And now the men who had promised not to dig Owen out were standing in his engineered earth room, relying on it like it was the only sensible thing left. Mara realized the point of no return had arrived. Once the town learned the cellar could save a man, it would not stay theirs alone. And the real cold still hadn't come. The night the temperature fell to 35 began with a silence so complete it felt staged. No birds, no distant river sound. Even the trees seemed to hold their creaks, as if the whole valley was waiting for a verdict. Mara stepped into the airlock just before dusk and looked at the thermometer nailed outside the hatch. The red column had dropped below the last marked line Owen had etched. Owen came up behind her and didn't speak at first. He simply stared, jaw set, breath shallow. "It's here," Mara said. Owen nodded once, "and it's still dropping." Wind slid over the hill in long, level sheets. It didn't swirl like a storm. It pressed like a hand, the kind of wind that found every crack and made it whistle. From below, faint sounds rose from Cedar Run, shouts carried thinly, then cut off. A dog barked once, then again, frantic, and then nothing. Mara's pulse sped. How long until they realize? Owen checked his pocket watch, the one thing he'd kept from his father. "Not long," he said. "When stoves start backdrafting, when chimneys ice, when people can't keep a flame steady, they'll try more wood. They'll burn faster. Then they'll run out." He looked at her, and the weight in his eyes was heavier than fear. "If anyone comes, it'll be in the first hour. After that, walking becomes math you don't win." Mara understood. At 35, exposed skin didn't just get uncomfortable, it became a countdown. They went back inside and prepared like they were packing for a siege. Owen checked the hood clearance on the exhaust pipe, knocking away a rim of frost. Mara stacked dry fuel within reach, but kept it away from the heater, leaving an aisle so people wouldn't stumble into iron in the dark. They moved their own bedding against the far wall to make a clear central space. Owen hung an extra lantern hook near the intake baffle and filled both lanterns, because darkness made panic multiply. Then the first knock came, not with a fist, but with something heavier, wood on wood, frantic, clumsy. Mara's body reacted before her mind. She was halfway up the steps when Owen caught her sleeve. "Wait," he said sharply. "Airlock first, one at a time." He opened the outer hatch a crack. A blast of cold air punched in, so sharp Mara tasted blood. A voice shouted through it, "Please, it's my boy." Owen widened the hatch just enough, and a woman stumbled into the airlock, hair crusted white, shawl stiff with frost. Behind her, a man carried a bundle that moved faintly. Mara recognized them. Elias and Ruth Halverson, Mrs. Halverson's son and daughter-in-law. The baby in the bundle made a thin, weak sound like a kitten. Ruth's eyes were wild. "The stove went out," she gasped. "The chimney, ice. Elias tried to clear it and—" Elias's beard was rimed solid. "We couldn't get the fire to draw," he rasped. "Smoke filled the room. We had to choose, smoke or cold." Owen shut the hatch, sealing the airlock. For a heartbeat, the cold was trapped with them, a living thing. Then he lifted the inner curtain and ushered them into the main space. The baby's cry changed as soon as they crossed the curtain, still weak but less frantic, as if the air itself had stopped biting. Mara cleared a spot away from the heater and unwrapped the bundle enough to see the child's face. Red cheeks, pale lips, breathing shallow, not frozen, not yet, but frightened into stillness. "Warm water," Mara said. Owen nodded and set a pot to heat on the iron box. He kept the burn low but steady, damper adjusted, so the draft stayed true, even as the wind outside pressed and released. Within minutes, more knocks came. Not one family, several. The cellar door became a heartbeat. Knock, open, close, breathe. Silas returned, this time with 2 teenage boys and an older woman, whose hands shook too hard to hold her own scarf. Caleb Voss came again, wrapped in extra cloth, his fingers bandaged but functional. Each arrival brought new moisture, snow melting in the airlock, breath thickening the room. Owen watched the candle flame like it was an oracle. He cracked the inner curtain for controlled bursts, letting fresh air mix without dumping cold. Then the wind hit harder, and somewhere below, a sound carried up that made Mara's stomach drop. A chimney collapsing, the brittle crack of brick and timber. A scream followed, cut short. Mara looked at Owen. "They're losing houses." Owen's face went pale under his stubble. He checked the watch again. "If people are coming, it's now," he said. "They've got maybe 15 minutes of walking left in this." Right on the word, the outer hatch rattled violently. Someone was pounding with both fists, not knocking, begging. Owen threw it open, and cold poured in like water from a broken barrel. A man fell into the airlock, then another, hauling a third between them, whose legs dragged wrong. "Help!" one shouted. "He can't feel his feet." Mara's mind snapped into action. She grabbed blankets, but Owen caught her wrist. "Air first," he said through clenched teeth. He pointed to the vent. The candle flame had started to tremble from the sudden influx. If they let too many in too fast, the cellar would become a sealed coffin. So Owen did the hardest thing. He closed the hatch again, trapping 2 men and the injured one in the airlock, while he stabilized the draft. The pounding resumed instantly from outside. More people, hearing the door close. Mara felt sick. "Owen, 2 minutes," he said, voice flat with effort. "Give me 2 minutes, or we all die in here." Mara pressed her palm to the inner curtain and listened to the airlock. Shivering breaths, muffled sobs. Outside, the valley was turning into a place where mistakes became bodies. Inside, their engineered hill was about to be judged by the only judge that mattered. Owen's 2 minutes stretched like wire. Mara stood with her back to the stone wall, forcing her lungs to keep a steady rhythm, while the airlock shook with muted banging. The candle flame near the heater quivered sideways, then steadied as Owen opened the intake baffle a fraction and eased the damper to restore draw. "Now," he said, and yanked the inner curtain aside. The man with the dragging legs, Harlan Pike, Mara realized, the mill hand, was half carried into the main room. His boots were rigid with ice, and when Silas tried to pull one off, Harlan screamed and nearly fainted. "Stop!" Mara barked. "Don't tear it." She took a knife and cut the laces instead, peeling the boot away as if it were stuck to him. The sock beneath was crusted with frost. The foot looked mottled, pale and grey-blue. Owen set 2 warmed stones near Harlan's feet, not touching skin, and draped blankets to create a small pocket of warmer air around his legs. "No direct flame," he reminded, voice low. "Slow rewarm, and we keep him awake." The other men, faces raw, eyes wide, kept glancing at the hatch as if expecting it to burst. It nearly did. A fresh wave of pounding came, followed by a muffled shout that Mara recognized with dread. Mrs. Halverson, the woman who had called the cellar shameful, was outside in 35, and she wasn't alone. Owen's mouth tightened. He looked around the room. Bodies now filled the cellar. Ruth and Elias with their baby, Silas, Caleb, the older woman, 2 teenage boys, Harlan on the floor, and 2 more men huddled near the far wall. Too many. The air felt thicker already. Moisture beaded along the lime-washed stone, despite all their precautions. The cellar was doing its job, holding temperature, but every extra breath was a demand on oxygen and a gift of water. "We rotate," Owen said, voice cutting through the chaos. "Airlock stays cold. Main room stays stable. 2 people at a time in the airlock to cool down their coats and shed snow. Everyone else stays dry." Silas blinked. "Cool down? In that?" "Your coats are wet from breath and frost," Owen snapped. "Wet inside becomes ice. Ice melts into water. Water steals heat. We can't afford wet." Mara saw Silas flinch, but he nodded. The man was finally learning rules from someone he'd mocked. Owen opened the hatch in short pulses, 5 seconds, 10 at most, letting in 1 person at a time, shoving them into the airlock, shutting it, waiting for the pressure of cold to settle, then lifting the inner curtain for a controlled entry. Mrs. Halverson stumbled in with her scarf torn and her cheeks white. Behind her was a lanky preacher, Reverend Darnell, carrying a lantern that had gone out. His lips were cracked, and his hands shook with cold or age or both. Mrs. Halverson's eyes darted around the cellar, taking in the heater, the pipes, the dry floor. Her gaze snagged on Mara like a hook. This is what you've done," she breathed, voice not accusing now, but stunned. Mara wanted to say 100 things. Instead she said, "Sit, drink, keep your gloves on." The preacher tried to speak and failed, then coughed a wet rattle. Owen guided him to the intake side, where fresh air entered, and handed him warm water in small sips. Outside, the wind kept pressing, and with it came a new terror. The hatch began to resist. Ice was forming on the outer frame again, faster than before, because the airlock was now warm enough from bodies to feed moisture to the seam. Mara saw the white fringe creep back, thicker, determined. "If it seals shut," she started. "It won't," Owen said, though his eyes flashed. He grabbed the warmed flat stone and set it against the seam again, then added a second and third, creating a line of gentle heat, like a fence. He turned to Silas. "You and the boys, you clear snow from the exhaust hood every half hour. If the draft fails, we suffocate." Silas hesitated. Going outside now was like stepping into a mouth of knives, but he looked at Caleb's bandaged hands, at the baby's shallow breaths, at Harlan's grey foot. "We'll do it," Silas said. Owen's voice softened a fraction. "Rope around your waist. One stays inside holding it. No hero walks away alone." Mara watched them tie the rope, watched Silas open the hatch and vanish into the airlock, then into the world beyond. The cold that rushed in was so violent It made the lantern flame jump. They closed it fast. The cellar steadied again. Minutes crawled. The room filled with small human sounds, muffled sobs, the baby's hiccuping cry, Harlan's teeth chattering, the preacher whispering a prayer that came out as frost. Mara moved among them, keeping wet coats out of the main space, swapping damp cloth for dry, pressing warmed stones near hands and feet. Each action was simple, but together they formed a chain. If one link failed, the chain broke. Then a tug came on the rope. 3 quick pulls. Owen and Mara hauled. Silas and the boys stumbled back into the airlock, faces glazed with ice. "Hood was crusted," Silas gasped. "We knocked it clear. Draft's better." Owen checked the candle. The flame leaned cleanly toward the heater again. "Good," he said, and the word carried more gratitude than pride. Hours passed. The cellar held around 40-40 despite the bodies and the cold outside. Not warm enough to relax, but warm enough to keep blood moving. The hill's mass did what Owen had promised. It refused to swing with the air's cruelty. Near midnight, the pounding stopped. Not because everyone was safe, Mara knew better, but because those still outside could no longer travel. The valley had gone quiet again, a quiet that meant decisions had already been made by frost. Mara sat beside Owen, exhaustion hollowing her. "Will morning come?" she whispered, as if it were doubtful. Owen stared at the thermometer, then at the people breathing in the dim light. "It always comes," he said. "The question is what it finds." Morning arrived like a bruise spreading across the sky, dark violet to grey, slow and reluctant. The first thing Mara noticed was the absence of wind. The hillside no longer hummed. The vent pipes stood still, rimed with frost but upright, like sentries who'd held their post through the worst hours and refused to brag about it. Inside the cellar, bodies stirred. The baby slept against Ruth's chest, breathing easier. Harlan Pike's foot had colour now, not healthy, not safe, but no longer that dead grey that made Mara's stomach turn. The preacher's cough had loosened into something wet, but survivable. Owen rose stiffly and checked the thermometer outside the hatch, through a narrow crack. His breath caught. "Still, 31, 31, he said. "But the drop has passed." Mara sat up, joints aching. "How many—" She couldn't finish. Owen's eyes flicked toward the hatch, then away. "We'll find out," he said quietly. They began the careful process of opening the world again. First the inner curtain, then the outer hatch. Slow, so the cold wouldn't punch in and steal what little warmth they'd banked in stone. The airlock was a rim of ice now, but the warmed stones had kept the seam from bridging shut. Owen pried away a thin crust with the edge of the pry bar, and the door moved. Outside, the landscape looked carved from salt. Snow had drifted into sharp ridges. The river in the distance was a solid, matte band. Cedar Run's chimneys stood like black fingers against pale sky, too still, too quiet. They went down together, Owen leading with the pry bar, Mara carrying a lantern, even though the sun had risen. In cold like this, light didn't mean warmth, it only meant visibility. The first cabin they passed had its door hanging open. Inside, the stove was cold, and the walls were filmed with soot, sign of a backdraft that had filled the room and forced someone to flee. Footprints led away, wandering, then stopping. Mara's throat tightened. At the next home, Mrs. Halverson's old house, the window glass had cracked in a spiderweb pattern from contraction. The chimney leaned slightly, mortar powdered on the ground like flour. A neighbour, Mr. Kessler, stood in the snow, staring at it, as if it were a dead animal. He looked up when he saw Mara and Owen. His face was raw, eyes red-rimmed. You kept them alive," he said, and it wasn't praise yet. More like disbelief that had finally found a shape. "We kept some alive," Mara corrected softly. More townsfolk emerged as the sun climbed. Men with scarves frozen stiff, women carrying bundles of bedding, children wrapped like parcels. They moved toward the hill in small groups, drawn by rumor and the fact that rumor had proved warmer than their own walls. Silas Brune met them halfway, limping slightly. His pride had been scraped down to bare wood. He glanced at Owen, then at Mara, and swallowed. "I was wrong," he said, forcing the words out like a splinter. "About all of it." Owen didn't gloat. He only asked, "How many are hurt?" Silas's eyes dropped. 3 bad. 2 didn't make it. He looked away toward the river. "If you hadn't opened that hatch—" Mara felt the weight of those unspoken names, those quiet houses. The cellar had saved, but it hadn't saved everyone. Even a good design couldn't rewrite time and distance. By midday, the settlement's informal council gathered at the base of the hill. No saloon, no store warmth, just people with numb cheeks and shaken certainty. Reverend Darnell stood among them, a blanket around his shoulders, and when he spoke, his voice carried differently than it had in sermons. "I prayed for mercy," he said, "but mercy arrived through labor, through foresight, through a hill that held steady when our pride did not." Mrs. Halverson stepped forward, hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. She looked at Mara, then at Owen. "I said it wasn't proper," she admitted, voice trembling. "I said God wouldn't bless living under dirt." Her gaze flicked to the cellar entrance. "But God blessed the living, and you made a place for them." Mara felt tears sting, and hated that her eyes would freeze if they fell. She nodded once. That was all she trusted herself to give. Then the questions began, urgent and practical, the kind that meant mockery had fully burned away. "How deep is the roof over it? What keeps the air from going foul? How do you stop water? How much fuel did you use?" Owen answered in short, clear pieces, pointing to the vent pipes, explaining the airlock, describing the drain trench and sump. He didn't lecture. He translated survival into steps. "Earth is insulation," he told them, "but only if you keep it dry. Air keeps you alive, but only if you control its path. Heat is easiest to keep when you store it in mass, not in gusty air." By late afternoon, men were already walking the ridge with spades, choosing hillsides, tapping soil, looking for places where stone and earth could become shelter. Women gathered lime and canvas. Silas organized a crew to cut pipe lengths and fashion hoods like Owen's, copying the angle that had kept snow from choking the draft. The cellar, once a joke, became a template. Weeks later, when the deep winter settled into a steadier rhythm, Cedar Run had 3 more earth-sheltered rooms dug into slopes, each with a small airlock and a pair of pipes rising like markers. They weren't as tidy as Owen's, but they worked. In spring, when thaw finally softened the ground and the river ran loud again, the council nailed a simple board near the original hatch. Not a grand plaque, just pine with burned letters, Hill House Shelter, built by Mara Kline and Owen Kline. Winter proved it. Mara stood with Owen and read it aloud, her voice catching on the word proved. Out in the sun, the cellar entrance looked ordinary again, just a low door in a hillside. But Mara would never forget how, on the night the frost hit, 35-35, ordinary respectability had failed, and a breathing hill had held steady.